Every morning before sunrise, 17-year-old Elijah Carter walked through a cemetery alone, not visiting anyone, not grieving anyone, just working, scrubbing mud off tombstones, pulling weeds from neglected graves, hauling dirty water in a bucket that was older than he was, for spare change, because that was the only way he could survive another day. No parents, no family, no address, no door in this entire world with his name on it. At 17, Elijah had already accepted something that most people spend their whole lives desperately running from, that he was completely alone. And the most painful part? He had stopped being surprised by it. Foster homes had taught him not to unpack his bag. Shelters had taught him not to take the top bunk because someone else always needed it more. The streets had taught him that kindness from strangers always came with an expiration date. So Elijah put his head down. He worked. He survived. Day after day after day. Until the evening, everything he believed about his life turned out to be a lie. It started the way the most life-changing moments always do. Quietly, without warning. His shovel struck something hard beneath the soil of an old forgotten grave at the far edge of the cemetery. He dug carefully. His fingers closed around a small, rusted metal box buried deep in the mud. Inside the box was an envelope, old, yellowed, sealed, and written across the front in faded ink that had absolutely no business still being readable after everything it had endured underground. 3 words. Just 3 words. To Elijah Carter. He stopped breathing, because not one single living person knew his full name. So how had someone written it on a letter, sealed it in a box, and buried it in the ground of a grave? Years before Elijah ever set foot in this cemetery, the answer would destroy everything he thought he knew, and rebuild him into something he never imagined possible. The cemetery sat on the forgotten edge of New Orleans. You know, exactly the kind of neighborhood where cracked roads stay broken just a little too long before the city bothers fixing them, where old churches stand half-empty on Sunday mornings, where houses slowly sag into themselves like tired old men and nobody writes about it in any newspaper because nobody considers it news. It was the kind of place the rest of the world drove through without slowing down. And at the very back of that cemetery, tucked behind an abandoned storage shed pressed against the rusted iron back gates, that was where Elijah Carter slept every single night. Not in a bed, not in a house, not in a shelter with warm meals and a counselor who checked on him after lights out. Just an old stained mattress on cracked concrete, torn blankets pulled up to his chin, rats moving through the walls after midnight. Rainwater finding its way through gaps in the tin roof every time a storm came off the river. At 17 years old, Elijah had already lived more hardship and more heartbreak than most grown men ever face in an entire lifetime. His mother died when he was just 6 years old. He barely remembered her face anymore. Just broken fragments that surfaced sometimes without warning. The warmth of her hands, a faint smell he couldn't name. The sound of her voice saying his name softly in the dark before everything went quiet and stayed quiet forever. His father vanished not long after she was gone. No explanation, no letter, no forwarding address. There one day and completely gone the next, as if he had simply decided that the weight of being a father was something he could set down and walk away from. After that, the system took Elijah. Foster homes, group shelters, back to the streets. Repeat. Some families were kind at first, the temporary kind of kind that lasts until a child becomes inconvenient. Others made no pretense of caring whatsoever. He moved from placement to placement so many times that eventually he stopped unpacking the small worn backpack he carried everywhere. What was the point of settling into somewhere that was never going to last? By the time Elijah was 15, he had stopped waiting for someone to rescue him. He taught himself how to survive instead. He learned which restaurants left food near the back after closing. He learned which shelters had open beds on the coldest nights without requiring paperwork he didn't have. And eventually, he discovered that families visiting the cemetery on weekends would sometimes pay a quiet, hardworking boy a few dollars to clean the grave of someone they had loved. So every morning before dawn, without an alarm, without anyone pushing him, Elijah rose in the dark and went to work. He scrubbed moss and grime off tombstones. He pulled weeds from grave plots. He swept leaves from the narrow paths between graves. He filled muddy ruts with gravel and patted them smooth with the back of his shovel. He worked harder than most people who were drawing an actual wage. And still, most visitors walked right past him without a word, without a glance, without any acknowledgement that he existed at all. Like he was invisible. Like he was just another feature of a landscape, as unremarkable as the iron fences or the oak trees or the shadows between the graves. But in those quiet spaces between the long hours of work, in those few minutes before exhaustion finally pulled him under at night, Elijah always came back to the same question, the one that never left him alone no matter how tired he was. Why had everyone left him? What was it about him specifically, not just any orphan, but him, Elijah, that made everyone who was supposed to stay go? He had never found an answer. Not yet. But the truth had been buried in this very cemetery for years, patiently waiting for exactly the right moment to find him. In a life as isolated as Elijah's, genuine kindness was so rare that when it showed up, he almost didn't trust it. But there was one person, one single person in that entire cemetery, in that entire part of the city, really, who treated Elijah like he actually mattered. His name was Walter Green. Walter was the head groundskeeper. He had worked that cemetery for so long that he knew where every grave was located without consulting a single map. Families called him when they couldn't find their loved ones' plots. The other workers deferred to him automatically without being asked. He was as much a part of that place as the oak trees and the iron gates. He was a quiet man, rough at the edges. His hands were permanently stained with soil, and his clothes carried the permanent scent of cigarette smoke and old coffee. He didn't talk much, and when he did, he didn't waste words. But from the very first week Elijah showed up asking if there was work available, Walter had watched him, quietly, carefully, with eyes that seemed to be measuring something nobody else could see. What he saw was a boy working himself to exhaustion every single day without complaint, without asking for extra, without ever once feeling sorry for himself out loud, even though Walter could see clearly that the boy had every reason in the world to do exactly that. One afternoon, Walter leaned against a fence post, watching Elijah scrub stubborn green moss off the base of an old marble headstone. "You work too hard," he muttered. Elijah didn't look up. "If I stop working, I stop eating," he said simply. Walter said nothing, but something shifted behind his eyes. From that day forward, he kept a quiet eye on the boy. He never made a production of it. He never sat Elijah down and announced that he intended to look after him. That would have felt too much like charity, and Elijah was the kind of young man who would have politely but firmly refused charity. So instead, Walter did small things. He left a paper bag near the storage shed some evenings, a sandwich, a bottle of water, positioned casually as if simply forgotten. He never mentioned it. He pretended not to notice when it was gone the next morning. On nights when the temperature dropped hard, he left the side door of the groundskeeper supply room unlocked, warm and dry inside, so that if Elijah needed it, the option was there without either of them having to acknowledge it out loud. One particularly brutal stormy evening, thunder cracking across the sky, rain hammering down in thick gray sheets, Walter found Elijah still outside working, soaked through, squinting into the downpour like it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Without a word, Walter walked over and placed an old flashlight in the boy's hand. "You shouldn't be out here working in the dark," he said gruffly. Elijah looked at the flashlight, then up at Walter. "Thanks," he said quietly. Just one word. But the look in his eyes said considerably more than that. Walter cleared his throat and looked away toward the rows of graves disappearing into the dark, rainy distance. After a long silence, he spoke again. "You ever wonder why life keeps pushing you down?" Elijah laughed. But it wasn't the kind of laugh that comes from something being funny. It was the kind that sits right on the thin edge between humor and tears. "Every single day," he said. Walter studied the cemetery stretching out ahead of them. All those stones, all those names, all those stories sealed permanently underground. "Sometimes," the old man said slowly, The dead carry more secrets than the living ever will. Elijah looked at him curiously. Walter said nothing more, just turned and walked back toward the main building, his figure dissolving into the rain and the dark until he was gone. At the time, Elijah filed the comment away as the kind of strange philosophical thing old men say when they've spent too many years surrounded by graves. He had no idea how precise those words actually were. He was about to find out. There was one section of the cemetery that everyone else avoided without discussion. It sat at the absolute farthest corner of the property, past the newer graves with their polished stone and weekly fresh flowers, past the older family plots with their wrought iron fences and faded photographs sealed behind glass, all the way to the ragged edge where the maintained paths dissolved into overgrown grass and shadow, and the boundary fence leaned at a tired angle, like it had given up trying to stand straight. In that far corner stood a single grave. The tombstone was cracked down the middle and listing slightly to one side. Weeds had consumed the entire plot so completely that the ground beneath them was invisible. Rainwater pooled there constantly, turning the soil into thick black mud. Whatever name had once been carved into the face of that stone had been worn completely smooth by years of weather and neglect. There was nothing left to read. No name, no dates, no indication that anyone had ever stood here and grieved. No flower holder, no photograph, no personal object of any kind. Just a forgotten stone in a forgotten corner that the rest of the world had agreed, without discussion, to ignore. The groundskeeping staff skipped that section entirely. It wasn't on any maintenance schedule. Nobody was paying for its upkeep. As far as the official record was concerned, that corner of the cemetery simply didn't require attention. But Elijah cleaned it anyway. He always had. Something in him, the same part that understood what it meant to be overlooked and passed by and treated as though your existence didn't register, could not leave a grave in that condition, even if no one ever came to visit, even if no one ever knew he had been there. On this particular evening, the sky had turned the deep bruised purple gray that rolls in ahead of a serious New Orleans storm. Thunder growled in long, low waves from somewhere beyond the river. The air smelled electric and heavy with rain that was minutes away. Elijah was on his knees at the abandoned grave, pulling thick fistfuls of weeds from the mud, working methodically the way he always did, focused, steady, unhurried. When he had cleared enough ground, he picked up his shovel to loosen the compacted soil around the base of the tombstone. He pressed the blade down, and then, clang, he stopped, pressed the shovel down again, more carefully this time. Testing. Clang. Something solid was buried directly beneath him. His pulse jumped. He told himself it was probably just a chunk of old concrete or a buried root. But his hands moved faster now, not stabbing with the shovel anymore, but scooping carefully, the way you move when something tells you that whatever is down there should not be damaged. A few minutes later, his fingers closed around something cold and metallic in the mud. He pulled it free. A small metal box, roughly the size of a hardcover book, rusted almost entirely brown from years in the wet ground. The hinges were stiff and the latch had corroded, but it gave with a firm, steady pull. Elijah opened it with shaking hands. Inside, wrapped carefully in layers of sealed plastic that had kept every drop of moisture out, was an envelope. Old, yellowed at the edges, the paper soft with age, but perfectly, impossibly, preserved. He held it up with trembling fingers and turned it toward the last pale gray light in the sky before the storm swallowed it completely. And then he saw the words written across the front, faded blue ink, the handwriting careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the kind of weight that comes from knowing exactly how much the words matter. To Elijah Carter. The shovel dropped from his other hand and disappeared into the mud. He didn't hear it land. He just stood there in the wind and the rising rain and the dark, staring at his own name on a letter that had been buried in this ground for years, placed here by someone who had planned far enough ahead to know that one day, somehow, he would find it. His whole body was shaking, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the cold. Elijah didn't open it outside. He couldn't. His hands were shaking too hard. The rain was coming down in walls now, and something deep and instinctual told him that whatever was inside this envelope deserved more than being torn open in the middle of a storm while standing knee-deep in mud. So he pressed it carefully inside his jacket, close against his chest, and walked back through the cemetery to the shed. He sat down on the edge of his mattress. Rain hammered the tin roof in waves. Lightning strobed through the gap under the door. The single bare bulb overhead swayed slightly in the draft coming through the cracked wall. The envelope sat in both his hands. He stared at his name on the front for a long time. Part of him was afraid to open it, because as long as it stayed sealed, it could still be anything. It could still be something good. The moment he broke that seal, it became real. And real things in Elijah's experience had a long history of becoming disappointment. But a stronger part of him, the part that had kept him breathing through every cold night and empty stomach, said, "Open it." He did. He unfolded the letter with careful fingers. The paper was thin and delicate, and he handled it the way you handle something irreplaceable. The handwriting inside was urgent, emotional. The pen had pressed harder in certain places, the letters slightly larger, slightly shakier, as if the person writing it was fighting to hold themselves steady. The words were plain and direct, but they landed like a fist against his sternum. If you are reading this, then I have failed to protect you the way I promised I would. My name is Samuel Carter. I am your grandfather, and there are powerful, dangerous people who never wanted you to exist. Elijah stopped. Read those 3 lines again. His grandfather. He had a grandfather, a man who knew his name, his full name, who had sat down and written to him and buried this letter here specifically so that one day he would find it. He kept reading. His eyes moved faster now. Your mother tried with everything she had to keep you safe. She was the bravest person I have ever known. Everything you were told about your family, every story, every silence, every absence, was constructed. You were not abandoned, Elijah. You were hidden. There is a difference. Please understand that there is a difference. Tears filled his eyes so fast he could barely see the next line. 11 years he had believed he was thrown away, discarded, left behind because something about him specifically was not worth keeping. And here, in words written by a man he had never met, someone was telling him that was never true. He wiped his face hard and kept reading. There is money, property, and truth waiting for you. But more than any of that, there is still danger. The people who destroyed our family have long memories. Trust no one you do not already know. But there is one man who you can trust with your life. His name is Walter Green. I arranged for him to be near you. He has been watching over you by my request since the day you arrived at that cemetery. He made me a promise. And Walter Green is the kind of man who keeps his promises. Elijah's breath caught so sharply he nearly choked. Walter. Walter had known. Walter, who left food near the shed, who handed him a flashlight in the rain, who had watched him for years with those steady, unreadable eyes, who had said just days ago, "Sometimes the dead carry more secrets than the living ever will." He had known this entire time. The letter ended with one final paragraph. Short, simple, but the most devastating thing Elijah had ever read in his life. I am sorry I could not be there with you. I am sorry for every night you were cold, and every day you were hungry, and every moment you believed nobody cared. But please hear this above everything else I have told you. You are the last surviving Carter, and you are always, always loved. Elijah pressed the letter against his chest and closed his eyes. And for the first time since he was 6 years old, he cried. Not entirely from sadness. He cried because, for the first time in his life, he held physical proof that someone had known he existed, had thought about him, had loved him enough to plan for his future from beyond the grave. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside that tiny leaking shed, something had shifted permanently, something that could never be shifted back. Elijah did not sleep that night. He lay on his mattress with the letter resting on his chest, reading it over and over until every word was memorized, until he could recite each line in the dark with his eyes closed, until the handwriting of a grandfather he had never met felt as familiar as his own reflection. When the first gray light of morning crept under the shed door, he was already standing. He found Walter at the main groundskeeper building before 6 o'clock, the old man just settling in with his first cup of coffee, moving through the slow, quiet ritual of beginning his day. The moment Walter looked up and saw the envelope in Elijah's hand, the color drained from his face completely. "You found it," Walter said quietly. Not a question, a recognition. Elijah's jaw tightened. He kept his voice controlled. "Barely. You knew about this." Walter set his coffee cup down slowly. He was quiet for a long moment. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. A bird called outside in the early gray. Then Walter nodded. Yes. One word. No excuse attached to it. No defensive explanation reaching for sympathy. Just yes. And somehow that plain honesty made Elijah simultaneously angrier and calmer than he had expected to feel. "How long?" Elijah asked. "Since before you arrived here," Walter said. "Your grandfather came to me years ago. He needed someone near you that he could trust. Someone who could watch over you without drawing attention. So you arranged for me to end up here," Elijah said slowly. "At this specific cemetery." Walter nodded carefully. Word reached the shelter network that there was casual paid work available here for young people who needed it. It was done quietly, through people your grandfather trusted. Nobody knew why except me. Elijah sat down hard in the nearest chair. "Why didn't you just tell me? Any of the times we sat here and talked? Any of the mornings you watched me work? Why did you let me spend years believing I had nobody?" Walter's eyes filled with something heavy and genuine. Not guilt performed for effect, but the slow burning kind that lives in a person for years with nowhere to go. "Because your grandfather made me promise not to," he said. "Not until you were old enough and strong enough to carry the truth without being broken by it. And because the people who came after your family were serious people, connected people. If they had any reason to believe you were being found, being identified, being linked back to the Carter name, they would have come after me," Elijah said flatly. "Yes," Walter said. "Keeping you invisible kept you alive." A long, heavy silence settled between them. Then Walter began to talk. Really talk. The way a man talks when he has been holding something in for far too long. He told Elijah everything. The Carter family had been established landowners in rural Louisiana for generations. Not wealthy in a flashy public way, but in that deep, quiet generational way that means real property and real roots and real money that doesn't advertise itself and doesn't need to. Elijah's father, Marcus Carter, had been a smart, ambitious young man who in his mid-20s got pulled into a business arrangement with men whose wealth came from financial fraud and stolen land. Men who used legitimate-looking deals to strip property from families who didn't fully understand what they were signing over. Marcus hadn't understood the full extent of what he was involved in until he was already in too deep. By the time he tried to pull back, he knew too much. And men who knew too much became problems that needed solving. Elijah's mother Diane had seen the danger clearly before Marcus fully accepted it. She had tried to take Elijah and disappear, new names, different city, far enough away that the people hunting them would lose the trail. She never made it. Her car accident, Walter said quietly, had not been an accident. The official record said she lost control on a wet road at night. Samuel Carter had never believed that for a single second. Neither had Walter. After Diane died and Marcus was arrested on charges connected to the fraud operation, Samuel faced the most agonizing decision of his life. He could claim Elijah openly, pull his grandson out of the system, and raise him himself. But that would announce to the very people who had destroyed his family that the Carter line was still alive, that there was still someone worth coming after. So instead, Samuel did the only thing he believed would keep the boy breathing. He let the world believe Elijah had been swallowed completely by the system with no connection to anyone. He arranged for Walter to watch from a careful distance. He set up the inheritance through a trusted lawyer. He buried the letter. And then Samuel got sick. And before he died, he made sure everything was in place for the day Elijah was finally ready to find it. Walter finished talking and went quiet. The room sat in silence for a long moment. "You watch me suffer," Elijah said finally. "Knowing all of this." "Every day," Walter said. and his voice broke slightly on those two words. Every single day, Elijah looked at the old man for a long time, and despite everything, despite every year of secrecy and silence, he understood. He didn't like it. He wasn't sure he had fully forgiven it yet, but he understood, because for the first time in his life, he realized something that hit him like cold water. He had never, not even on his darkest, most desperate night, been truly alone. When Elijah had first opened the envelope the night before, overwhelmed, hands shaking, rain hammering the roof, he had been so consumed by the words of the letter that he almost missed what else was inside. It was only now, sitting across from Walter in the gray morning quiet, that he turned the envelope upside down and a small object slid out onto the table between them. A key. Small. Silver. Precisely made. Old but deliberately maintained. Not a single spot of rust on it. Walter picked it up and turned it over slowly in his fingers. His expression shifted immediately into something Elijah couldn't fully read. "I know exactly what this is," Walter said quietly. He looked up. "This is a bank safety deposit key." Walter explained that in the months before his death, Samuel Carter had worked with a trusted attorney, a sharp, thorough woman named Cecile Beaumont, to establish a safety deposit box at a downtown New Orleans bank. The arrangement had been constructed carefully to survive long after Samuel was gone. It could only be accessed by someone who arrived with the key and could provide 3 specific pieces of identifying information: Elijah's full name, his date of birth, his mother's maiden name before she married Marcus Carter. Information that only the real Elijah Carter would know. The next morning, Walter drove him downtown in his old truck. Neither of them said much. The city moved past the windows in its usual vivid, indifferent way, the color and noise and motion of New Orleans going about its business, completely unaware that something enormous was happening in one quiet truck on one ordinary street. At the bank, the manager on duty frowned slightly when they explained why they were there. She checked her records, then checked them again. Then her expression changed into something unreadable, and she excused herself and disappeared into the back without explanation. She returned several minutes later, carrying a large sealed metal box. She set it on the table in front of Elijah and stepped quietly back. He opened it. Inside were layers of documents, property deeds, legal papers, financial statements, letters from attorneys. More paperwork than Elijah had ever seen in one place in his life. Walter moved through it steadily, picking up document after document with quiet recognition in his eyes. There were photographs. A man and a woman, young, smiling, standing in front of a large old house surrounded by oak trees draped in Spanish moss. A small boy between them, 3 or 4 years old, laughing at the camera with complete, unguarded joy. Elijah stared at that photograph for a very long time. There was also a thick envelope of cash, more money than Elijah had ever seen in his entire life. And at the very bottom of the box, wrapped carefully in protective casing, sealed and dry, was a small rectangular object, a recorded tape. Walter arranged for them to play it at a branch library nearby. The librarian helped set it up without asking many questions. The screen flickered, then resolved. A man sat in a wooden chair in a simple living room. Old, thin in the way that comes from illness rather than hunger. His hands rested quietly in his lap. His eyes were dark and direct and carried a weight that had clearly been there for years. But when he smiled at the camera, slow and warm and slightly sad, Elijah recognized something in that smile immediately. He had seen it in his own reflection his entire life. "If you're watching this," the man said, his voice roughened by age and everything he had been carrying, "then I'm probably already gone. And I am more sorry about that than I have words to say." He paused, steadied himself. "My name is Samuel Carter. I am your grandfather Elijah, and there's so much I need to tell you." For the next 40 minutes, Samuel told his grandson everything. The history of the family, the land, the fraud, the threats, the impossible choice he had made to keep Elijah hidden and alive when every part of him wanted to do the opposite. He spoke about Marcus, Elijah's father, with the complicated grief of a parent watching a child destroy the life they were given. Disappointed, heartbroken, still loving him despite everything. And then near the very end, Samuel Carter looked directly into the lens. Directly at his grandson across all those years of distance and silence. And he said softly, "Your mother loved you more than anything she had ever loved in her entire life. Every decision she made at the end, every risk she took, was because of you. You were her whole world." Elijah's hands were pressed flat on the table. His shoulders were shaking. Because in 17 years of living, through every foster home and shelter and cold, empty night, no one had ever told him that. He had spent years in the quiet wondering if his mother had loved him. Now he knew. Among all the documents spread across the table, there was one single piece of paper that Elijah kept returning to. Not a property deed. Not a financial statement. A legal document. Official header. Case number. And a name printed plainly in the middle of the page. Marcus Elijah Carter. His father's name. Beside it, a prison facility address. Elijah sat with that piece of paper for a long time before he said a single word. He had grown up believing his father was dead. That was the story the system had quietly allowed to solidify through years of no one saying anything different. No records. No contact. No trace of a living man. But here it was in black and white. His father was alive. The feelings that moved through Elijah in that moment refused to be simple. Anger. Because this man had been breathing and existing on this earth for Elijah's entire life. Every cold night, every empty stomach, every day Elijah had felt invisible and alone. His father had been somewhere. Alive. Confusion. Because anger felt too easy and forgiveness felt impossible, and somewhere between them was a complicated wreckage he had no map for. And underneath all of it, quiet, stubborn, refusing to be reasoned away. Hope. Walter didn't push him in any direction. "That decision is entirely yours," he said simply. "Whatever you choose, I'll support it." Elijah sat with it for several days. He went back to work in the cemetery. He cleaned graves. He thought. He reread the letter. He heard Samuel's voice in his head speaking about Marcus with that grief that only a parent carries for a child who has wasted what they were given. On a gray Tuesday morning, Elijah looked at Walter and said, "I want to go." The drive to the prison was long and mostly silent. The visiting room was exactly what he had imagined. Plastic chairs, fluorescent lights humming overhead. The thick atmosphere of waiting and regret that saturates those places permanently. Guards along the walls. Families clustered at small tables speaking in low, careful voices. A door opened on the far side of the room. A man walked through it. He was thinner than Elijah had pictured. Tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. The kind of tired that comes from years of carrying the full weight of your own worst choices. Gray at his temples. Deep lines in his face. He moved slowly and carefully like a man permanently braced for bad news. He was scanning the room. Then his eyes found Elijah. He stopped walking completely. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Then Marcus Carter covered his face with both hands. His shoulders shook. He crossed the room and sat down across from his son for the first time since Elijah was a small child. And for a long time he could not speak because he was crying too hard to form words. "I thought you were dead," he finally managed. Barely above a whisper. "They told me, I was told, I believed." He stopped, pressed his mouth shut hard, tried again. "I looked for you," he said. "Before I was arrested, I looked everywhere. After, I wrote letters, filed requests. They kept telling me there were no records, that you had disappeared into the system and couldn't be traced." Elijah sat very still across the table. "Why did you get involved with those people in the first place?" he asked quietly. No anger in his voice. Just a question that deserved a real answer. His father closed his eyes. "Because I was young and I was greedy and I convinced myself I was smarter than I was," he said. No self-pity. No reaching for sympathy. Just the flat, honest weight of a man who had been sitting with that answer for years. By the time I understood what I was really part of, it was already too late to walk away clean. And the people who paid the price for my mistakes. He looked directly at Elijah. Were the people I should have protected. The silence between them sat heavy and real. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. Not all at once. Some damage takes longer than one visiting room conversation to begin healing. But it was a beginning. And Elijah Carter, a boy who had built his entire life out of nothing, knew exactly what to do with the beginning. The story got out the way truth usually does, slowly at first, then all at once. A legal claim was filed. Old property documents resurfaced. The attorney Cecile Beaumont, sharp and relentless, and exactly the kind of person Samuel Carter had chosen her to be, moved through the court process with a thoroughness that left no opening for challenge. The name Carter attached to a decades-old fraud case with unresolved estate claims caught the attention of a local journalist. And suddenly, what had been a quiet legal process became something considerably more public. The story was almost too strange to believe. A teenage boy living behind a cemetery shed in New Orleans had turned out to be the sole surviving heir of a family whose property and inheritance had been deliberately buried, both literally and legally, to protect him from the people who had destroyed everyone around him. Overnight, it seemed the boy that no one had ever looked at directly became the center of everyone's attention. Reporters wanted interviews. People with business cards and careful smiles appeared with offers and opportunities. Distant individuals who shared absolutely no actual connection to the Carter name sent warmly worded letters about family ties they had apparently just remembered existed. Elijah was polite to all of them. He trusted almost none of them. The only people he trusted were Walter, steady and present as he had always been, and Cecile Beaumont, who had been holding the Carter estate in careful legal suspension for nearly 2 decades, waiting for exactly this moment, and who fought for Elijah with the same ferocity she would have brought to any case regardless of how much attention it was receiving. Within months, the inheritance was fully restored. Property, land, accounts. Everything Samuel Carter had spent his final years protecting was returned to the last surviving Carter. For a boy who had never owned anything, not even a mattress, that was fully his, the reality of having something permanent and unchallengeable was almost too large to process all at once. But here is what mattered most about who Elijah Carter turned out to be. He did not disappear. He did not take what was his and vanish into a different life and never look back. He went back to the cemetery. He went back to the graves he had cleaned for years, the well-maintained ones with fresh flowers and the forgotten ones at the edges with the overgrown weeds. And he cleaned every single one of them that week, by hand, with his bucket and his brush and the same quiet, focused effort he had always brought regardless of whether anyone was watching or paying or cared. Walter stood at the edge of the path one afternoon, watching him work. "You could leave this place now," he said. "For good. Start fresh somewhere entirely new." Elijah sat back on his heels and looked at the clean face of a restored old tombstone. Then he looked up at Walter. "This place kept me alive," he said simply. "It gave me work when I had nothing. It kept me out of the cold. It was where I was supposed to be." He paused. "You don't walk away from a place like that." Walter looked at this boy, this 17-year-old who had survived things that would have finished people twice his age and 3 times his size. And for the first time in a very long time, the old groundskeeper smiled. Not the careful, measured smile he used to keep people at a distance. A real one. Months passed. The legal process completed. The Carter family property, a large piece of land outside the city with a grand old house that needed serious work, but had good bones and the unmistakable feeling of a place that had once been deeply lived in, officially became Elijah's. He didn't rush to move in. He used part of his inheritance, first for something else entirely. He restored the cemetery, not just his grandfather's grave, the whole property. Broken paths repaired, sunken graves releveled, faded tombstones cleaned and re-engraved where the names had worn away. The overgrown section at the far corner, where a rusted metal box had once waited patiently in the earth, completely cleared and properly maintained for the first time in years. He hired stonemasons and landscapers and lighting specialists, and paid them properly. And then he went further. He funded the construction of 2 small shelters at the edge of the property. Warm, clean, secure. built specifically for homeless teenagers in New Orleans who had nowhere else to sleep. Because Elijah Carter knew better than almost anyone alive exactly what it cost a young person to have nowhere to go. He established a program supporting young people aging out of the foster care system. 17 and 18-year-olds suddenly cut loose with nothing in their pockets and no map for what came next. And he didn't manage these programs from behind a desk. He showed up. He sat with the kids who came through. He listened to their stories without flinching. He didn't pretend the hard parts would be easy, or that money fixed everything, or that years of being unseen could be undone overnight. He told them the truth instead. You are not what happened to you. You are what you decide to do next. Word spread the way word about real things always spreads, not through press releases but quietly, person to person, in the language of people who desperately needed to believe that something like this was actually possible. On an evening in early spring, when the cemetery was still and the oak trees along the restored paths were full and green, and the light was doing that impossible golden amber thing it does in New Orleans just before the sun finishes setting, Elijah walked alone to the far corner of the cemetery, to the grave where he had found the box, where all of it had begun. The tombstone stood clean and straight and fully restored now, the name re-engraved deep and clear into the stone, fresh white flowers in the holder, a small warm light glowing at the base as the sky slowly darkened above him. Samuel James Carter. Elijah crouched down and placed his hand gently against the stone. He stayed there in the quiet for a long time. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, low enough that only the earth and the trees and whatever exists on the other side of a grave marker could hear, he said, "You kept your promise." The wind moved slowly through the cemetery. The oak leaves stirred. Somewhere above him a bird called once and went silent. And Elijah Carter, the boy who had once been invisible in this very place, who had slept on a broken mattress behind these gates, who had cleaned these graves for spare change while carrying a question that had no answer, finally felt peace. Not the fragile, temporary peace of exhaustion. Real peace. The kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are, where you come from, and that the people who were supposed to love you actually did, even when the whole world made it look like they didn't. He had found money. He had found land. He had found a father who was slowly, painfully, one visiting room at a time, trying to become someone worth knowing. But more than any of it, he had found his name, not just 2 words on a faded envelope. The full weight of it, the history behind it, the love inside it. He had always had a name. The world had just been hiding it from him. If this story moved something in you, subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because sometimes the answers we spend our whole lives searching for have been waiting for us all along. And even the most forgotten person in the world can still have a story powerful enough to change everything.